Let's talk some NFL draft rumors, predictions, and let's see what we're going to do with Breece Hall over the coming weeks. That is what we're going to talk about today on the RotoViz Fantasy Football Podcast. My name is Colm Kelly. I'm joined by Theo Gremminger, and we are going to talk about those things that I teased. We're going to have a second podcast later this week where we're going to talk through some, I think, very interesting topics about the running back position. So we are going to be quite running back centric on the two shows this week with Theo, but I wanted to welcome Theo in. I want to do a podcast with him for a long time. I've mentioned this about the guests that I've had on this show so far. It's a while since I had the wheel to be like, right, I'm having a guest every single week and I'm going to pick who I want to have on and talk to them. So got back in that chair and wanted to get Theo on here. So I'm looking forward to this conversation. And Theo, you have just changed companies that you're promoting and doing your content with. You're now with Fantasy Points. Myself and Sean Siegel had Scott Barrett on last week. We talked about the NFL draft. So do you want to let the listeners know about the change and what you've got planned, obviously, over at Fantasy Points for the coming weeks and months?
Yeah, so I did some work with Fantasy Points this year on the Dynasty end, and I started a podcast with Scott Barrett. Not started. Scott started it on his own, but I joined it as a co-host, the School of Scott podcast, and that was a lot of fun last year. I know Sean Siegel came on that show with Scott. It's a really, really good show. We had a lot of fun with that one. But yeah, now I'm coming on full-time and have expanded the shows that I'm doing there. Dynasty Life was a very popular show over at Player Profiler. I'm bringing that one over with me. And then the big one is Fantasy Football Daily. I'm doing multiple shows a week there. A lot of them this time of year have been NFL draft focused, but I've been trying to mix in some other just general fantasy shows in there. But how can you not talk NFL draft predominantly this time of year, especially with this incoming class that we're very, very excited about? But that show will eventually be 4 or 5 episodes a week. I'm dropping 3 of those a week now. I have some very cool guests lined up. So yeah, very happy to be over at Fantasy Points. I know you just had Scott on the show. There's a lot of really, really awesome people to work with, and I'm really excited about my content maybe reaching some new audiences this year. So also super excited to come on here. I've had Sean Siegel on a few of my shows. Tons of respect for what you guys do over at RotoViz and your shows as well, Colm. But this is the first time we've actually chopped it up together.
Yeah, so I'm looking forward to this. And obviously, I kind of working through my words at the start, I didn't get in the phrase congratulations, but congratulations on the move across as well. So we are going to jump into the topics to keep it ticking along. And I think that something running through I spend time on X, on Twitter, on social media. Sean, obviously, on RotoViz Overtime, he does not. But I did go through your Twitter feed over the last couple of days, and I seen that you mentioned generational wealth for dynasty managers is on the horizon. And that was in regards to Ashton Jeanty, obviously the top running back prospect in this class. A lot of hype, a lot of buzz around him with his college profile and what he's been able to achieve. My question for you is, obviously, generational wealth for dynasty managers is, for people who were drafting Brock Bowers and tight end premium last season, that is kind of, generational wealth at the tight end position. But in terms of running back prospects, how far are we going back here for, a comparison to Jeanty? Best running back prospects since who?
That's a really, really good question. And I tend to lean towards the Saquon people because that was the last time we had this sort of excitement and this sort of like locked in draft capital. I was head over heels for the Bijan Robinson, Jahmyr Gibbs class, without a doubt. Jeanty seems like a cleaner prospect than either at this point in the draft. And Jeanty also seems like he could be drafted ahead of where, I mean, it's really kind of like nitpicking here, but Jeanty seems like the guy who could go in the top 4 as opposed to Bijan, who went 8th overall. Gibbs is a guy who I was higher on than some. I know you guys were quite high on at RotoViz as well, but he was not one that people were pounding the table. At the time, people thought this could be a Reggie Bush type outcome, a guy who catches a ton of passes, a high value touch kind of killer. He's turned into even better than that. But I would say that slightly ahead of the Bijan, Jahmyr Gibbs group, you probably have to go all the way back to Saquon. And then when we factor in fantasy football, I think that Jeanty has this ultimate combination of a guy who is extremely efficient, breaks tackles, can break off big plays as a runner, but I think has overwhelmingly underrated potential as a receiver as well. So I think this is a guy fantasy-wise, when we say generational wealth, we're talking about a running back who got multiple seasons of 20-plus points per game, and I think he'll be very much in the mix for the 101 in single QB redraft before it's said and done.
Yeah, when you factor in, like you mentioned, Saquon, obviously there was a lot of excitement when he was coming into the league about the profile and the optimism. There had been some running backs around that time drafted in the early spots of drafts. We had Zeke Elliott, we had Leonard Fournette, and like Fournette, for example, was one that we felt like was much too early in terms of the capital there. But the overall profile here for Jeanty, and I think it fits in pretty well with those guys that you've mentioned. CMC is somebody who I believe it may have even been Scott referenced him being kind of in the same caliber, but all those guys. And more so Barkley and CMC fit in that profile of we have seen the historical run off their careers. Whereas with Bijan, for example, we're still like, we're getting those games, but it always feels like there's a little bit more potential for him to take that next step. We've got it from Gibbs at the end of last season, but he's always been squeezed there, with his running mate in Montgomery. So the next part, basically, I've set it up there as it's been challenging for those based on some of the situations they find themselves in with the running back competition or how the teams have wanted to use them. What would be the dream landing spot here if you're looking for like the peak outcome in the rookie year, and then as we move forward for dynasty value to continue to increase that generational wealth kind of profile? Where would you like to see him land here in the draft?
So I think with Jeanty, for the fantasy football like top end upside outcome, we want to land on a spot where he'll be utilized as a receiver and not have too much competition in the backfield. A lot of times these offensive coordinators want to go with a committee approach, and even a running back cutting in, with 40% of the snaps, a guy who could maybe take away some valuable targets from Jeanty. I want him to avoid those guys. And it's actually funny where the landing spot that's favored in the Vegas odds is actually a spot that I think we can all get excited for fantasy-wise, and that's the Las Vegas Raiders. When you look at the overall makeup of the team, Brock Bowers is sensational. He could be a 150 target tight end, which is extremely rare. But if you look at other pass catchers on the team, after Jacoby Myers, it's pretty sparse, and Myers doesn't really project to be a guy whose utilization is going to continue going up and up. It's probably about stagnant. Last year seemed like a peak outcome for him. And you look at the running back room, it's completely barren of talent. Raheem Mostert's going to be 32 years old this year. Sincere McCormick was an undrafted free agent, and Dylan Lobby didn't really register. So, like, Jeanty could step in, be the number 3 target on the team right out the gate. I think also when you look at the success that Pete Carroll's had with running backs, and also what Chip Kelly's capable of, where I think there's some question marks with Chip Kelly in terms of the tempo. But Colm, it's not going to be a slow-paced offense with Chip, no matter how you cut it. So I think all of those factors kind of would indicate to me that Jeanty would move up in ADP. He's probably 1-2 turn now guy now in like FFPC early best balls. I think he'd creep up a little bit closer to like the big 4, and I think he'd probably be in consideration right alongside like Devon Achane next year in terms of where he's getting drafted and redraft.
Yeah, I think this is what happens when we get to draft season. We always have we have a player, we want a landing spot, and then all of a sudden you're like, this player gets drafted to a situation where there's already a pretty good running back, or there's a situation where he's drafted into competition. So that is obviously the kind of dream scenario. We're all looking at the backfield in Vegas and being like, whoever lands there is in a real strong spot. Similarly, whoever lands in Washington with the Commanders is in a really long spot. But the problem is they're drafting much later in the draft, and they're not going to have that opportunity. When you're looking at those particular spots, it's interesting because the question we're going to take up in a moment, again, it feels like a default answer at this point in terms of where you want a running back to land. But one of the teams picking one pick after the Raiders in this year's draft, the Raiders having the 6th pick, they have the 7th. That's the New York Jets. And then the conversation coming out over the last kind of 48 hours or so is that, the Jets are considering possibly trading away Breece Hall. And, they would be very much more open to that if they were able to get Jeanty at pick 7 in terms of how things would go. So that would also mean that our dream scenario would have to not occur. But just going back again to the college profiles, have you much of a gap between what you have on Jeanty now versus when Breece Hall was coming out? Because when Hall was coming out, he is somebody, and still is, just this, I feel like the injury and then the situations haven't really all come into full effect, but he has that profile that could give you those kind of legendary seasons. What's the difference in them as profiles? Or are we looking at Hall being too far away for you from his college profile and it's hard to compare those two players at this point.
Yeah, so when I do NFL draft capital, NFL draft content as well, and I'm always, I don't know, maybe a little too fantasy influenced with some players, but I did think that there was a chance that we would have saw Breece Hall go in the first round a few years back. I was, along with you, very, very excited about Hall at the time, but he was never a guy that we thought could go inside the top 20. It was some teams going to maneuver themselves to select Breece Hall somewhere inside the last 10 picks of the first round, and he could get that sort of draft capital. Ends up going early in the second round, but I agree with you. Like, Hall had a ton going for him as a prospect. That speed score was outstanding, put on a show in that regard, and it was the combination of size, explosiveness, and pass catching ability that sort of checked a bunch of boxes for us for fantasy football. But yeah, I mean, as prospects, Jeanty head and shoulders above Hall, even though Hall was, by all accounts, a very, very good prospect.
So then we get into the conversation with Breece Hall. I've mentioned how much I like him. And last season, you had Aaron Rodgers there, you had Devontae Adams then coming in mid-season. The Jets were a mess overall. We have seen the big plays from over the course of the last 2 seasons, but just not on a consistent basis. But if you were the Jets, and you have to factor in, obviously, the rookie contract and the negotiations that are going to come with that and so on, would you be looking actively to move Hall at this point?
Well, we have Tanner Engstrand coming in as the new offensive coordinator, which should be exciting for people because of the connection to Ben Johnson in Detroit. But if they want to go with some sort of a committee backfield for better or for worse, this is the sort of year where you can add extra bodies, and potentially, if you don't take Jeanty in the first round, you could double tap the position with very intriguing players in like rounds 3. They have two picks in round 2, I believe, as well. I'd have to pull that one up for the Jets. But when you're looking at them, they have multiple picks where intriguing running backs are going to land to them. I think if they're not going to extend Breece Hall, potentially pivoting off of him is not the worst strategy NFL-wise. Now, for us as fantasy managers, it's sort of like, why would they get rid of Breece Hall? I don't know. It's one where if they don't seem to want to pay him. And I think there is a disconnect when you speak to people who consider themselves NFL analysts versus fantasy football analysts. They have a much lower opinion of Breece Hall than we do. So maybe the Jets sort of share in their light. This is one where he's lost a ton of value in Dynasty, Colm, which is very interesting too. It's very, very odd times for Breece Hall, a guy who finished RB2 overall in year 2. Such ability as a pass catcher, but the team just seems like they're just ready to move off of him. It seems like a rumor that has a ton of legs, and one that I think might actually happen on NFL draft weekend.
Yeah, and it's interesting as well because you're coming up to the draft. You'd basically be looking, if you could, to move him and then get in Jeanty. But there is the case that they could move him and still have additional capital throughout the draft and pick up multiple running backs. They don't actually have 2 second-round picks, but they do have all their picks through the first 4 rounds. Then they have 2 in the 5th, 2 in the 6th. But there's still going to be running back options in those areas. But moving Hall for capital would give them a lot more wiggle room in terms of moving in the draft. I feel like with Hall at the moment, it's really a huge buying opportunity, because the worst thing could happen, and probably now, is staying with the Jets the way things have all played out. But he is going to, the end of May here, he's going to be 24. Still a nice window to play him for a year or 2, and then to still move him, age 25, 26, heading into, 3 seasons from now. So I still feel like there's a big buy window there for him. I just feel like, sometimes when you get a player in a situation, we can't really say it was CMC in Carolina because he still had the production along with it, but there is certain players in certain situations, and some of it is the team or the organization or the offense that's holding those players back at times. So I still like Hall, and if he does move, you mentioned Vegas a minute ago. That would be a nice landing spot. I've mentioned the Commanders. I would love to see him in that backfield, paired up with Jaden Daniels. I feel like they're 2 organizations going in kind of 2 different directions. Maybe the Jets will just stay in that middle of the pack. But where would you like to see him land before we talk compensation for what teams may have to give up here?
I mean, any of the landing spots that we'd be very excited about a rookie landing on, we should be open to being excited about. If Breece Hall landed there, I mean, throw in Dallas into the mix. Yeah. I think that would be an interesting one. A high-profile name landing on a franchise that loves taking on those sort of second chance guys. that could be a quick turnaround. And why did the Jets move off him type year, especially considering that we think it's going to be an above average offense. The team that I think is interesting is one that has continually added skill position players with high draft capital, but they did it on other teams, and that was Cleveland. Cleveland sort of had this model where they acquired Elijah Moore, they acquired Jerry Jeudy at the wide receiver position. Both of those guys were high draft pick guys, and they got them for cheaper. And with Jeudy, it looks like he's completely turned around his dynasty outlook. Cleveland has multiple needs, including quarterback. Everybody's pointing to the 33rd overall pick, saying that could be the landing spot for Travion Henderson, a Quinshon Judkins. Name your favorite rookie running back. But what if Cleveland also has needs for additional pass catching weapons? They have needs for multiple defensive spots. So for me, Cleveland could address other needs, potentially trade like a 4th round pick for a Breece Hall. And that could be a spot that we get really, really excited about just because of the availability of touches, the potential for Hall to excel as a receiver there. I think that would be a really fun one.
Yeah, and the part that, I mentioned the Commanders, and they have some ways they can do it with the cap, but you mentioned the Cleveland Browns. Wouldn't essentially, like, it would be, I think, a good spot. I think the Cleveland Browns have, a lot of holes, particularly with their quarterback situation at the moment, but they do have a lot of draft picks in this draft that would allow them to do that. They have 2/3. They're 4th. They have no 5th. They have 4 6th round picks, and they may be able to, get something done, particularly with like the likes of that 3rd pick. If we're looking at 3rd round pick, that is, if we're looking at the Commanders, they just have their 1st, 2nd, 4th, 6th, and 7th, and they do have, quite a few different needs, mainly on the defensive side of the ball. I think with, taking Samuel and having McLaurin, they've re-signed Zach Ertz. I think if you go now and get yourself a stud running back, your offense is pretty much set. So I could see them trying to do it. The part I think is I think that you're going to need to be a little bit higher with your draft capital than the 4th round pick that they have. How are you feeling in terms of what teams should give up? Do you think a 4th would get it done? I think you're probably looking at least a 3rd. And the only reason I'm saying that it's that versus even a little bit more is the contract situation. You're going to have to, take him and then sign him to that contract extension.
Well, so I was completely with you, and I had suggested a 3rd round pick, and this was Brett Whitefield, who's one of the best in terms of like NFL analyst and prospect analyst that I know in the industry. He thinks that it's not going to quite be a 3rd round pick. So kind of going a little bit off of Brett's there. I was in the same realm with you, where I thought 3rd round pick for a guy with his sort of production and his sort of age, where you factor in a few things with Hall. NFL teams might hold the injury history against him. NFL teams are also going to know that they have to pay him. It's the last year of the contract. And then you factor in just the overall sheer quality of this draft class, where I can get a running back for cheaper on a contract, get a longer period of time with him on this rookie deal, and draft that guy in round 3. Maybe he lacks a little bit of what Hall has, but he has enough. Like, I can take DJ Giddens in round 3 and get him on a cheap contract versus Hall and have to pay him a very, very big contract. So I think that sort of thing sort of factors in with my 4th round price tag versus, I agree, talent-wise, a 3rd rounder makes total sense.
Yeah, I actually think you're probably correct there, in the way you've played that out. And this particular year is probably not the ideal year. We've seen it with the veteran running back class, for example. It's not the ideal year to be a running back who's looking to, get moved or to be in a different situation. So that is pretty fair. I'm very intrigued to see what happens. And as I mentioned, I do think, if we get a good landing spot, but the fear with these moves is always that you get into somewhere where there's a running back who's, okay, but not great, and then you're kind of locked up in a situation where they're sharing touches throughout the course of the season. But that there, I think it's really nice to have a storyline heading into the draft where we're looking at that. The other thing I noticed on your Twitter feed over the last couple of days, here's a question: are you calling it X now, or are we still on Twitter?
I try to say X, but it's hard to switch a term you've used forever. So I say both.
Yeah, I'm still pretty stuck. But then you mentioned updating your dynasty rankings for fantasy points. 3 out of your current top 10 running backs are rookies. 11 out of your top 48 are rookies. This point was 28 days away from the running back monsoon on NFL draft weekend. I think that this is something we've been talking about all offseason, is the fact that so many of these veteran running backs are in trouble when we are moving forward here to the NFL draft. And, if we go back and use the examples last year of, let's say, a Bucky Irving, who would be the example that came in and just, took the backfield over before the season's end. I think this year we could see it even happen earlier in the season. But which veteran running backs do you feel at the moment are in the greatest danger? Those ones that if there's, dynasty managers listening and they should be like trading away right now. It's your last window here.
So I think that there's multiple running backs that are in that RB2 range and multiple running backs who might be considered low and RB1s in Dynasty that are in trouble because of the sheer depth and quality of this draft class. I think that, when you start talking about running backs that are very intriguing in this draft class, most years you kind of get it down to about 7 guys. Some years fewer, some years maybe a little bit more. This year, Colm, there's like 14 guys for me. I go down to a guy like Rashard Smith at running back 14 for me, somewhere in that range. He rises between running back 12, running back 14. Like for me, he'd be a huge problem for a number of running backs profiles out there because of what a good pass catcher he is. Then you look at certain guys like Jarquez Hunter, Taj Brooks. These guys are all going to be a big pain for certain running backs. But when it comes to the like pure getting nuked, teams that could use a day 2 pick, teams that could use a very early day 3 pick and put a lot of running backs in trouble. I mean, I think certainly the low-hanging fruit, and neither one has a ton of dynasty value right now, but I think that the Liam Cohen is going to rescue a Travis Etienne, or Liam Cohen is going to somehow propel Tank Bigsby to new heights because of the quality of his offense and the opportunity there. I think that Jacksonville is absolutely going to add a running back this draft class. This is also, you mentioned Bucky Irving. Liam Cohen was the offensive coordinator that oversaw Bucky Irving taking over a very successful fantasy running back in Rachaad White the year before, and a Todd Bowles favorite in Rachaad White. So we already saw that. I certainly think that Tyrone Tracy is one that's interesting because
that was I'll let you go, but that was one I thought might sneak through the window. I was going to mention, but
I mean, listen, Tracy is one that we love and one that does a lot of things. If you go to Fantasy Points Data, if you go to RotoViz, there's going to be a lot of stats that people can point to with Tyrone Tracy and say, this guy not only is somebody who is appealing, but this is a guy who can take a next step next year. And he's got the history of being a wide receiver, the receiving profile. He's got size, athleticism. But at the end of the day, we're talking about a day 3 selection that is 25 years old already, be 26 next season. One thing that bodes well for Tracy is the fact that Brian Dable's back. Brian Dable oversaw his ascension. But at the end of the day, you're talking about a profile where when we get into these day 3 guys that have production, and certainly James Robinson was an undrafted free agent, but that name comes to mind. Great rookie season. Tyler Algier, 1,000 rushing yards as a rookie. Great rookie season. Both those guys get nuked on draft day. And I think when you look at New York, let's say that they go into the season with Russell Wilson and Jameis Winston as a starting QB and maybe quarterback competition. I still think they could add a rookie this draft that could kind of throw a wrench into that. But how do you protect low-end quarterback production? I think by having a really positive ecosystem around them. And when I look at the Giants, if they're not going to draft a quarterback, then maybe they walk away with a franchise running back. Certainly that early second-round pick, there's going to be some intriguing names around them. If they say the name Travion Henderson, New York Giants, early second, you can rip up your Tyrone Tracy shares.
Yeah, the thing with Tracy is as well, we're looking at a second-year player, but he has turned 25 already. In terms of like second-year players, you're at the very high end of the kind of age curve there. We were, touting him a lot last offseason, because of his draft capital and where he was going in rookie drafts and where he was going in best ball drafts. But the picture changes quite a bit when you're like looking for a player who could really, move in terms of what his value is then to a player now where you're looking at him even, in best ball drafts and different situations where if that happens, it is a landmine that's slanting right on top of them. So there's quite a few. And I feel like if I go through current best ball ADP, and I'm a Packers fan, they had a really strong season last year. And I think him having a strong season almost derailed the Packers offense. But like Josh Jacobs is in a situation where he's a second round player in best ball. I think I think most teams are going to end up with a rookie throughout just on the law of averages throughout this class. And you're looking at, we talked about Breece Hall. I think if he leaves the Jets and lands in a favorable spot, he may end up being one of these veterans who actually comes out best, even though he gets moved away, as I mentioned there. But James Cook, I'm a little bit concerned about, more so from an age profile, James Conner, if some players come in there. I'm concerned about Najee Harris. I like Jalen. There's players here that I'm going to mention who, if they avoid a running back coming in, but the Steelers have talked about wanting a running back to go along with Najee Harris, Joe Mixon, Alvin Kamara. Aaron Jones is already getting squeezed a little bit with the recent trade, but him. You mentioned Etienne, Pacheco. There's a lot of these guys who I think could get hit, and I think the players who could get absolutely devastated then are the perceived backups in these offenses at the moment, and things could get really, really dark for those particular players. Like we mentioned, the Buccaneers already, but Rashad White now in terms of his descent from where he was last year. But if the Buccaneers draft one of these running backs, it's not going to be ideal for Bucky Irving, but it's going to absolutely crush those secondary running backs in terms of their value here as we move forward. If we look at kind of just opening it up to the draft itself and any position, I would imagine it's going to be Jeanty. So if it is him, we could skip him. But is there a player who is your favorite player in this class, and what's kind of the upside case for his rookie season if you're painting that picture?
A player that I've been really high on for a while now, and I've sort of dug my heels in, and it's worked out for me, was Omarion Hampton. I can remember getting in big Caleb Johnson versus Omarion Hampton arguments on other podcasts. Everybody sort of had their favorite RB2 in this class behind Jeanty. But when you look at Hampton, he has everything needed to sort of be a really, really strong asset for us in fantasy football. I'm going to have him somewhere in my top 6 or 7 running backs in the dynasty rankings from the get-go. He has the size. He has the ability to handle volume. He is an absolute hammer when he has to be, which is going to be very appealing to NFL coaches, getting him on the field in multiple situations. Back-to-back seasons with 1,500 rushing yards in the ACC. There's only been 3 other players who have done that. They've all had big-time fantasy football success. Lamar Jackson, Dalvin Cook, and Travis Etienne. And then you factor in that Hampton has very strong pass-catching ability for a player of his size. Now, I don't think he's going to be a Bucky Irving type, and I don't think he has the pass-catching potential of a Travion Henderson, but I think he can be an every down back in the NFL and be a guy that catches 55-plus passes on multiple seasons of his career. So for me, Omarion Hampton, I think will have multiple seasons of RB1 production. I think I'm taking him at the 102 in Superflex formats right now, despite the fact that I think Cam Ward's going to be the first quarterback, the first pick in the NFL draft. So Hampton's a guy that I think is a really, really, really strong value for us in terms of fantasy football. And I think he elevates the entire class because when you factor in what we expect from Jeanty and then you add in Hampton, you're talking about a ton of running back production. I like Travion Henderson too, though. It's a very, very deep running back class, but I'd say Hampton's been a guy that I'm going to continue to sort of flag plant.
Well, we can't say Las Vegas Raiders for this, but dream landing spot for Hampton.
Denver Broncos. Denver Broncos is the dream landing spot for Travion Henderson or Omarion Hampton. I love Washington, and that's another spot that at 29, I think if you just look at, this is the way the NFL is going. A running back is coming back. We saw Jonathan Taylor get paid. We saw immense success with Derrick Henry and Saquon Barkley on new teams last year, not to mention the fact that the last time we saw first-round talent running backs get drafted, both of them have been smashing successes with Bijan Robinson and Jahmyr Gibbs. So everything's sort of set up there. But if you just look at Denver is just screaming for a running back to land there and would propel themselves,
consolidate the role.
In instant RB1 role. You have the quality offensive line. You have a quarterback we believe in Bo Nix, a quarterback with mobility in Bo Nix to create some rushing lanes. And you have a coach and offensive coordinator who have a history of peppering their running backs with targets. Even if Omarion Hampton just stepped in and had 90% of the Javonte Williams receiving role, that would be more than enough when you factor in what he can offer you as a runner. That Denver Broncos running back role is awesome for a rookie running back to land in. It would be awesome for Henderson. It would be awesome for Hampton. We're really, really rooting for it. We got a big bullet was dodged because they acquired Evan Engram. So we think they'll be less likely to consider a Colson Loveland in that spot. So yeah, we're feeling it now, Colm. Let's get a running back in Denver.
Yeah, and we've been chasing it. You get the Sean Payton running back numbers from the New Orleans Saints if you want to get excited, and we've been kind of chasing it over the last couple of seasons. It hasn't really happened. There's been a multitude of running backs kind of trying to fulfill those roles, and they haven't really done it. So yeah, it's set up really nicely if we can get that. Then when we look at the opposite side of the spectrum, we're looking at players who are likely to go in the first 2 rounds of the NFL draft who we are concerned about, who we don't want really to have anything to do with it. Is there anyone that you can't really understand the hype on so far, or you fear that they won't translate to the NFL level?
I've been lower on Tre Harris than some, and I think this is a fantasy football litmus test, where Tre Harris, some people absolutely love him. They love looking at the metrics. They love pointing out the fact that he had 1,000 receiving yards in like 7 games at Ole Miss, and I think that there's some intriguing things with Harris. But when I look at Harris, I don't think the NFL draft capital is going to match up with what the fantasy community wants. I think he has a chance of falling into the 3rd round, and the hit rates there for that sort of profile are low. I also think when I look at Harris, I can get Jaden Higgins lower than him in some rookie drafts, and I know in early mock drafts, I've been able to select Higgins after Harris multiple times. I like Jaden Higgins more. I like Jalen Noel more, and I can get those guys a little bit cheaper, at least right now. So that's been a profile I've been out on. And it's funny, if this was a month ago, I probably would have said Luther Burden, but Luther Burden's been a guy that's been so beat up in the community the last month that I actually think he could turn into a value in rookie drafts. So I will put Luther Burden with an asterisk. I think if Burden ends up getting a great landing spot, ends up steaming up extremely high in rookie drafts, and there's a big course correction, then I'm probably out. But if Burden ends up in this range where he falls to the early 2nd round and people start fading him, then I think he could turn into a value. So it's Tre Harris for me. I probably won't have a whole lot of, and Luther Burden with an asterisk. He could kind of go either way here, Colm.
And the interesting thing, like just for people with preparing for their dynasty drafts, it's why it's so important to have your players. Obviously, you can rank them by number, but having them in tiers, because if you have somebody, you're on the clock and Harris is available, and you're like, I don't really like him that much, and I like these 2 guys more. Moving back and gaining those additional picks for that additional capital. I think it's so important to have it in tiers rather than just your list drawn up. The last thing that I'm going to mention here, I want to get a bold prediction pre-NFL draft. Can be anything, can be selections in the 1st round, player to crush it. But what is your bold prediction here as we stand kind of 2 weeks out from the NFL draft?
I love the bold predictions. I'll say 3 running backs go inside the 1st round. I feel pretty strongly about this one.
Can you give me inside the first 25 picks?
Sure, I'll give you inside the top 25. Washington has to trade up. They trade with Houston to get to pick 25, and they end up selecting Travion Henderson 25th overall. Omarion Hampton goes to Denver, or slightly higher with Denver trading up. Ashton Jeanty goes 6th overall to the Raiders. And this is one that I feel very strongly about. I also think we're going to have 2 tight ends selected inside the top 15 overall. I think that people are going to really value the Colston Loveland profile NFL-wise. I think that Colston Loveland ends up going to the LA Rams. The LA Rams trade up with Miami and select Colston Loveland 13th overall. And I think Tyler Warren might be a Chicago Bear off the board at 10, really trying to speed up the ascension of Caleb Williams. We get Ben Johnson, his own sort of Sam Laporta. In Tyler Warren, and we get 2 tight ends inside the top 13.
Yeah, and I think, again, the success of the rookie tight ends in recent seasons, or even the young tight ends, if we toss the like of a Trey McBride into that, is going to, I think, have the NFL kind of following some of those trends of, that it can work out early in their career. So excited for the rookie tight ends to get drafted early. I also think that it's going to be interesting in those rounds, kind of 2 through 4, in terms of how the running backs go, because of the depth. We may see, people be like, well, a bit like I'm talking about in the dynasty drafts, have a tier, and I'm like, we like 6 guys here in this group. We'll just see how it plays out. We could have, but if they start to go that little bit earlier in round 2, I think we could see some of those other names, pulled up and make it quite interesting for the.
I have one round 2 prediction for you then.
Oh, hit me with it.
Bashal Tutin, San Francisco 49er, pick number 43. And people will come around on this landing spot and be very excited about it as a potential successor to Christian McCaffrey. I think San Francisco is going to take a running back in that spot. They lost Jordan Mason. It's a talented class. Christian McCaffrey's getting older. Bashal Tutin goes 43 overall to the San Francisco 49ers. They have 11 picks in the draft. They can afford to take a risk with a position like that at 43.
Yeah, so you're starting to crush Garendo a little bit there in that scenario, but I do think it would be a real fun landing spot, and you would also have the intrigue of, when you're at your rookie drafts, what if Christian McCaffrey can't stay healthy for the season? It could be rookie wheels up straight away. So excited to see where he lands. I know he's a player that Sean has talked a lot about. I know when Scott was on last week, they had a little bit of a segment where they just waxed lyrical about Tootin. So we are going to see how it plays out here at the NFL draft. But it has been awesome having you on, Theo, getting to talk through some of the draft scenarios here, and also to talk what we'll do with Breece Hall over the coming months. We are going to talk, though, on the next edition, just to tease ahead, about it's better to be out too early on some players, and it's important not to give up too soon on others. So we're going to talk about that on the next edition. But as we close out here, you're over at Fantasy Points now. Anything you want to plug again, or same as the top of the show?
Fantasy Football Daily. That's the one I'm dropping the most episodes. School of Scott and Dynasty Life. And then my articles, Dynasty Rankings, will all be up at Fantasy Points as well.
Awesome. And you can follow him also on Twitter at the OG Fantasy. Be sure to follow him on X or Twitter, whichever you want to call it. But that is where we're going to close it out today. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on socials at Overtime Ireland. And until we are back, have a good one.